There's a progression in the Bible that we see beginning in the Old Testament as it relates to how God's people viewed the afterlife. This month in the Smyth and Helwys Formation series, we're looking at a unit that deals with what happens after this life. And in the Old Testament, it began with really no concept of an afterlife. Eventually, there became this understanding of Sheol, a somewhat semi-existence. Of course, we know eventually in the New Testament, we come to understand the believer's resurrection. And we see that in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The theology of the Old Testament was very much cause and effect, and they believed that doing good things in this life meant rewards in this life. Of course, when we took a look at the book of Job last week, we see that there are some holes in that theology, and it doesn't always work out like that. Today, we're going to consider two passages from the prophets, the major prophets, Isaiah and Daniel, who prophesied and considered the idea of a resurrection and rewards beyond this life. We begin with Isaiah 26, verses 12 through 19. Many scholars believe that Isaiah was prophesying about a resurrection of the nation of Israel following the exile that we refer to as the Babylonian exile. It appears that the basis of Isaiah's argument is his observation of God's love for, his grace, and his mercy towards his people. Let's take a look at verse 12. We're in Isaiah chapter 26. O Lord, you will ordain peace for us. Isaiah believed that it was God's intention for his people to be at peace. In verse 13, O Lord our God, other lords beside you have ruled over us, but we acknowledge your name alone. Talking about the sovereignty of God and how God was more powerful than any of the other gods people in that day came to understand. In verse 14, because you have punished and destroyed them and wiped out all memory of them. God is a just God, and he will pass judgment upon those who are evil. And then in verses 16 through 18, he uses the analogy of pregnancy and of the pain of childbirth and the crying out for mercy as he relates to how God will hear the cries of his people and will show once again his grace and love towards them. And then finally in verse 19, your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise, O dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a radiant dew, and the earth will give birth to those long due. Again, many scholars believe this is referring to the resurrection of the nation of Israel. Our other focal passage comes from the book of Daniel. Daniel was a prophet that lived during the time of the Babylonian exile. We're going to be looking at chapter 12, the first 4 verses. Verse 2 caught my attention in particular because he says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Here Daniel sees two different and divergent paths in the afterlife. One path leads to everlasting life, the other leads to shame and everlasting contempt. And then verse 3, those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Here Daniel sees a life of eternity with God. As I have read and meditated on these verses this week, 3 observations have come to my mind. First, death is not the final word. For us as Christians, we do not need to fear death because it's not final. And what happens in the next life will be something that we can look forward to, we can celebrate, and can take confidence in. The second observation is that not everything that happens to us in this life is fair or just. Often, like Job, we are confused. Sometimes we're angry at God. But this we can take to heart. There will be justice in the end. All will be made right when we join our Father in heaven. Regardless of how unjust things may have been for us here, it will all be made right in eternity. When our spirits align with those truths, it does have a major impact in how we choose to live today. We don't need to concern ourselves with what is fair or just. We can take confidence that in the end, God will make all things right. And finally, how we choose to live in this lifetime matters. The decisions we make about where we're going to focus our life, what we choose to trust in and take confidence in, these things will make a difference not only in our life today, but in eternity. Next week, we're going to be taking a look at the New Testament and what it says about the afterlife. We'll be in chapter 25 of Matthew. The title of next week's lesson is The Prospect of Judgment. We'll be looking at how God's judgment should impact the choices and decisions we make in this lifetime. Well, I hope you'll join me again next week. Until then, God bless you, and we'll see you next time.